All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amber Mace, and I am the Interim Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We were created at the request of the legislature 30 years ago, a little over 30 years ago, to be a resource to help tap into the network of expertise that we have in California with our partner institutions and beyond, in this incredible network of academic institutions and federal research facilities and national laboratories. And I am very pleased to bring some of those experts to you today to talk about the environmental impacts of wildfires. And we can bring resources to you in any number of ways through these briefings that we host, through reports that we do in partnership with our experts from the partner institutions, and also very directly through the CCST Science Fellows Program, where we bring PhD scientists to do a year-long fellowship in the legislature. Do we have any fellow alums or current fellows in the audience? Yay! All right. So thank you for joining us, and it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator of the panel. And this panel today is in partnership with the California Environmental Legislative Caucus, and we're pleased to have our second in a series of briefings on wildfire. And our wildfire panel today is being moderated by Dr. Susan Hubbard. She's the Associate Lab Director of the Earth and Environmental Sciences area at the Berkeley National Laboratory. And she is also a proud CCST council member, or we are proud to have her as a CCST council member. At the lab, she leads a premier group of over 500 scientists focused on climate change, ecosystem and watershed science, environmental biology, and subsurface energy strategies. She is an expert in her own right. Her expertise is in watershed science, carbon cycling, contaminant remediation, and ecosystem characterization methods. She's teaching a course right now at Berkeley. I wish I could take it. And she is just a wonderful resource to us. And so it is my pleasure to turn it over to her and to the panel.
Thank you so much, Amber, and thanks everybody for coming. We're excited about the panel today. I think, as everybody recognizes, wildfire is an extremely important topic and also a very multifaceted topic. The 2018 wildfire season was the deadliest and most destructive on record, and that only beat out the previous record, which was the year before that in 2017. I think we're all recognizing that there are many factors that contribute to the increases that we're seeing in wildfire occurrence. Part of these are the environmental conditions, clearly the changes in precipitation and temperature and wind patterns. Part of these are our forest management strategies. Part of this is the increased development at wildfire-urban interfaces. And we're also recognizing that from a science and technology perspective, as we start to tackle this wildfire challenge, that there are many, I would say, categories of science and technology we're thinking about. There's aspects of advanced technologies to help firefighters make decisions. This was a focus of a previous CCST panel. There's aspects of forest management strategies based on current knowledge. And because environmental impacts or environmental conditions are so important for how fires start and how the forests evolve, we also need to think about how to coexist with future fires and what this means as we look forward decades in the future, as the climate may be different and the vegetation may be different. Today, as Amber said, we'll focus on one particular category of the wildfire challenge, and that is the wildfire impacts, and in particular, water quality impacts, air quality impacts, and human health. And we should note that there are several other environmental impacts that we won't have time to cover today, such as landslides and soil erosion and biodiversity. But I think we have a good group of topics to start off with this discussion here today. It's worth noting that the air and water quality impacts from a fire can last from months to years after a fire and can impact millions of people far from the actual burn site itself. So that's an important thing to consider, and I think we'll bring that up as we go through our discussion this morning. Today we hope to discuss the state of the art associated with wildfire impacts on the environment and health, and also to identify what are some of the biggest challenges as we move forward. I'd like to introduce the panel. Today we have three experts who are working on different aspects of this challenge here. I'd like to ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, to say where they're from, and maybe to tell us a little bit about your current research and maybe some of your early findings. After we have this short statements from our panelists, we'll turn to the audience and ask you what you'd like to hear about, what questions you have. I may kick that off, but we'll see what kind of questions are coming forward. So please be thinking about questions. This panel is really for you. We're here to help you understand this and to hear what your questions are. So with that, Jackson, may I ask you to kick us off?
Sure, thank you. My name is Jackson Webster. I'm an assistant professor at Chico State University. My department is civil engineering. My background is civil and environmental engineering. And for the past 6 years or so, I've been studying wildfire across the West and looking at changes in forest soil based on wildfire, or the effects of wildfire on forest soil, and how that impacts water quality. Specifically, some of the things I've looked at are mercury transport and how wildfire influences mercury biogeochemistry in downstream waters. I've also been looking at carbon cycling and how wildfire changes carbon export from burned watersheds. And this is important because that carbon can actually become halogenated when we use chlorine to treat that water. So we create disinfection byproducts, which are carcinogens in our drinking water. So wildfire can have many effects on our drinking water, both from an environmental and kind of human health aspect.
Michele.
Thank you. My name is Michele Newcomer, and I'm a research scientist at Berkeley National Lab. My expertise within the realm of fire and water stems from many years of research on surface water-groundwater interactions with the Sonoma County Water Agency, which was impacted by the 2017 wine country fires. So my research expertise really stems from understanding water and chemical flows across the continuum of groundwater through surface water, where I use the watershed as the defining unit for understanding changes in water quantity and quality after a fire. So as I mentioned, and what Jackson mentioned, the watershed is really this integrative unit where we have to understand the behavior of aquifers, groundwater systems, as well as surface water systems to understand the loading from runoff as well as infiltration after a fire. So you can imagine precipitation falling on a landscape. Some of that water goes into the groundwater, some of it goes into the river. And so before the October 2017 fires, my research using hydrological models was focused on understanding within Sonoma County the effectiveness of their riverbank filtration systems. And these systems rely on the natural filtration benefits of sediments with the lower riverbed. And there we recognized very early on that dissolved organic carbon, or DOC, was a major control on the efficacy, as well as the removal of contaminants and the hindering of pathogen movement through their riverbank filtration systems and impacting the delivery of water to their constituents. And this is for people across Sonoma and Napa counties. So the delivery of high quality drinking water was of importance to them. So within days of the October 2017 fires, I mobilized a team with folks out of the Sonoma County Water Agency, as well as the U.S. Geological Survey, and we were able to mobilize quickly to sample the water quality across the watershed at key juncture points that we identified ahead of time. And what we did is we formulated our monitoring response to be representative of pulse-based storm events. So you can imagine there's these pulses, as well as the low flows during the dry season, which is very important to consider as well for contaminant loading. So we have been and will continue to monitor for organic carbon, nitrogen, iron, PFAS, mercury, sugars, anions, cations, and as well as riverbank sediments. So we know that mercury can accumulate in these sediments as well as in the food chain, so we're monitoring that as well as DNA within the sediments. And I will make a note here that with the Sonoma County Post-Fire Water Quality Sampling Program, we focused heavily on the water quality sampling aspect, but we backed it with a very rigorous scientific framework to facilitate the interpretation of those data sets and to facilitate the quantitative understanding of what we were seeing and whether or not it was related to any post-fire issues. So based on some of our current findings, we're seeing some fluctuations in pH within the river. We're seeing loading of organic carbon, and we know that this is going to have some impacts to the efficacy of the riverbank filtration systems. Within the current research literature, we also know that in surface waters, the loading of contaminants can last for years. However, I would like to mention that the contaminant issues within groundwater can potentially last for decades. And so that's an issue that I think we have to begin thinking about. Our approach within Sonoma County is also a relatively novel approach, thinking about the watershed as a complete unit where a fire in one part of the watershed will also impact other parts of the watershed as well as the groundwater. So we anticipate that this work will provide future guidance for the county as well as some best practices for other agencies to think about how to respond in their own counties when a fire occurs.
Thank you very much, Michele. Mary.
Good afternoon. My name is Mary Prudicke. I'm with the Sean Parker Center for Allergy and Asthma Research at Stanford University. I have been studying the impact of air pollution and now wildfires on health for the past 5 years, focusing primarily on children. We investigate the impact on allergies, asthma, immune health, and now cardiovascular outcomes when there is exposure to air pollution or wildfire. The wildfire smoke is composed primarily of PM 2.5, which is particulate matter that's 2.5 microns or smaller. So size-wise, to put it in perspective, like it's the width, 1/30th of the width of a human hair is the size of the particle we're talking about. During a wildfire, levels of PM 2.5 can easily shoot up to 200 micrograms per meter cubed or higher. And that is equivalent to about smoking 9 or so cigarettes. The rule of thumb that is kind of tossed around is that for every 22 micrograms per meter cubed of PM 2.5 you're exposed to, it's like smoking 1 cigarette. So a level of 200 is approximately 9 cigarettes. When PM 2.5 is inhaled, it goes deep into your lungs. It's small enough that will cross into the bloodstream. And then it goes throughout the body, causing havoc with inflammation and other problems. So some of the things that have become very clear in the literature is that wildfire smoke exposure does cause respiratory effects. We know that when there's wildfire smoke exposure, there's an increase in emergency room visits, there's an increase in hospital admissions for asthma, COPD, pneumonia, and acute bronchitis. That is clear. It has also become clear that exposure to wildfire smoke has cardiovascular outcomes. There was the largest study in California on wildfire and health impacts, looked at emergency room and hospital admission data across all of the California wildfires for 2015. And they found that for those people aged 65 and older, there was an increase in strokes, in heart attacks, in cardiac arrhythmias. We also know from other studies that in general, exposure to wildfire can increase mortality between 8 and 18% within a population. Some of the groups at risk include small children, so newborns up to age 4, and also adults age 65 and greater are at increased risk for asthma hospital admissions when the PM 2.5 rises even 10 micrograms per meter cubed. And then we also know people with pre-existing respiratory and cardiovascular outcomes are going to be more susceptible to the health effects of wildfire smoke exposure.
Thank you, Mary. Maybe if I could start off with a question in reverse order, staying with you. Could you tell us a little bit about what you think are maybe the most significant needs or gaps right now, and then what's your next step?
Okay. So what we've learned is that there is a huge gap in our knowledge on on interventions during wildfire smoke exposure. So, for example, we know that N95 masks filter the particulate matter, but there's no studies looking at specific health outcomes like immune biomarkers or other things to show what advantage there is and at what time point should you put on a mask. And there's no clear-cut health guidelines regarding the mask. They don't fit children. There's different comorbidities such as respiratory and cardiovascular problems, and they don't recommend people like that wearing the mask. So there's a lot of confusion regarding that. And then also HEPA air purifiers. There's been a few studies looking at the using them during the wildfire smoke exposure, but as far as randomized controlled trials where we can have definitive data on who should be using them and at what point during smoke exposure is lacking.
Interesting. Michele.
So in terms of my next steps, there's a few things I'm doing with the Sonoma County Water Agency, and they include continuing our water quality sampling program and also developing a long-term plan, since we recognize the importance, as well as the fact that these contaminants are not going to go away, but it's rather going to be a long-term issue. And we're also focusing on managing the groundwater as well. So with that, I also would recommend that in terms of a research need, the role of fires on groundwater is a relatively unexplored field. So there's not much in the literature, there's not much sampling that's done, and groundwater is one of those situations where 500,000 people in California are potentially using these small modular systems that are pulling groundwater. They have private wells, and groundwater contamination after a fire could potentially impact these specific communities where they don't have access to large treatment plants. So I think the research need is very much in the form of groundwater sampling, as well as understanding the role of the watershed as a unit. I mentioned that a few times already, but groundwater and surface water, they're highly connected. So if you see contamination in one location, especially the groundwater system, that's going to move eventually and may reach the river system 20 years down the line.
Thanks, Michele. Jackson, what do you think are near-term and longer-term needs?
Sure. So one of the things that I've noticed in looking at kind of post-fire water quality is that there's really a paucity of data when we're trying to predict and develop models for kind of post-fire water quality. So we need more work developing the linkage between what's happening on the landscape and then how that influences our water quality. A great example of this and kind of an emerging area is what happened in Paradise in the Camp Fire. A lot of the data that exists on wildfire is actually focused on the watershed and forested environments. And we've seen now in Santa Rosa, in Redding, in Paradise, that we're increasingly having burning urban structures, right, and suburban structures, homes, businesses. Really, there is no data that describes what's going into the water when these types of events happen. So one of my fears right now is that we don't even really know what the contaminants are that we're supposed to be looking for, that we should be looking for, because a lot of the potential contaminants are degradation products that were generated during thermal degradation of plastics and household materials. So I guess the short answer is we need more data. We need data that we can use to build models that allow us to evaluate the effects of these events on our watersheds.
Very good, thank you. I'd like to turn to questions in the audience. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm with the California Low Carbon Fuel and Energy Coalition, and one of the things we've been looking at is you talk about all this paucity of data. Water, soil quality, forest management, human health impacts, all of these things are tied together, and we seem to have been, first we looked at emissions from industrial and transportation, and we didn't look, I think, soon enough at how climate change was really impacting the natural environment, because now we've seen that the impacts from there are so much more severe. do you see a nexus for us to be able to blend this together? And how can folks like us help develop this? And, where do you see? Again, I get frustrated. I worked for a utility 10 years ago. We saw wildfire risk, and we saw it financially. We didn't explore ways that we should be investing with the science community. Where do you think we can make some of those connections now?
Michele, you might be able to say something about watershed perturbations and predictive understanding.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and start off in answer to that. So I think you mentioned a few things: climate change, urban fires, and we've heard that a few times here. So I think one of the things that comes from that is as we understand climate change and how climate change is going to impact fires, especially at this wildland-urban interface where it's not just forest fires, these are structures, as Jackson mentioned. So we have to be thinking about how to bridge sampling as well as the scientific background for understanding that, and then, for example, developing a plan to take what we know from our water quality, bridge that with an understanding, and potentially provide funding, for counties to be able to monitor their own situations, after a fire, or provide funding to update their treatment systems, or provide funding for people to be on these modular systems if they're on well water, for example. So I think those are a few things that can be done to bridge the sampling aspects with the scientific background to understanding what we're seeing, and then funding to help these communities, which a lot of them may be disadvantaged communities. And some counties may be able to do this and some may not. And that's really a disparity in terms of who has access to updated treatment systems and who doesn't.
I would add to that there is a need to do forest management, especially around the community. So there's a landscape component of this too. And so we need to be thinking, especially for communities that are on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, for example, like Paradise, where you have a lot of biomass growth. Are we taking care of the forest in a way, especially around these communities, in a way that we could potentially prevent this?
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm intrigued about your question about the impacts of the buildings, and I too am interested in the impacts of buildings under natural disasters and what happens to them. So, with that said, are you also looking at the utility infrastructure systems and some of the mitigation, forest management strategies that are being undertaken or considered, and the impacts they may have as well?
So, if I'm understanding that correctly, you're referring to the infrastructure, like for example, the drinking water distribution systems,
or utilities, the materials being used for the so power poles, transmission poles, even the transformers, whatever's in the substation. All those things have very toxic transformers have very toxic materials in there.
Sure.
And whether there's membranes that kind of isolate them from becoming a water issue, or obviously an air quality issue. You may not have strategies for that, but there might be some strategies that are used at other kind of industries that isolate some hazard materials that we still need to use.
Sure, that's a really great point. So you mentioned like transformers. Historically, PCBs were used in a lot of electrical utilities. We have in some of the water quality sampling that we've been doing, we have seen pentachlorophenol, which can be used as a wood treatment. I don't know if that's coming from wood power poles, but certainly I think that the communities could begin to think, or the state could begin to think about potentially looking at non-flammable materials like power pole, putting in metal power poles instead of wood power poles. We've seen with the water utilities in Paradise, brand new plastic water meters were used, and they've been being installed for a long period of time now. Well, they did not last through the fire. We saw things like the utility boxes, which were made out of concrete and had metal cases, actually, or metal tops, acted like an oven and melted everything inside of it, and that's causing even more problems in trying to respond to the getting everything back up and working. So, yeah, there's a huge need to examine the infrastructure and look at how it performed in these fires, and then try to adapt. I think moving forward the best that we can. In a place like Paradise, I think you have an opportunity right now to, as you're rebuilding, think through some of these things. Whereas maybe other communities don't have the resources right now to actually replace everything in their towns.
Great questions. Others? Yes. Yes. You.
I think this question is for Mary. Hi, Mary. I'm Jeff Williams from the California Air Resources Board and the Research Division. And you mentioned or identified some needs and data gaps. One of the needs you mentioned was information around HEPA filtration. We know a lot about HEPA filtration, that it's very effective at reducing PM indoors.
Right.
But I'm assuming what you mean is what you're referring to is health studies that show a clear benefit. Is that what you're referring to?
Right. In residential, we're more focused on minority, low-income communities where there might be in older homes, or not have a HEPA filter on their air conditioning unit, not have an air conditioning unit, and what is the best way to implement HEPA filtration, and what type of health benefits would we actually reap by doing so in those types of communities.
And then just one other thing, your reference to the 22 microgram per cubic meter as one cigarette, is that over the course of a 24-hour period? How is that defined?
Oh boy, there's like a long mathematical equation that was derived from. I can give you the reference.
And the last thing was the study you mentioned in 2015. Is that Bill Fisk's study?
Is that whose study?
Bill Fisk, or is that who was the study that you
For the California 2015 Wetstein?
Okay.
Yep.
So we won't ask you to drive the approximation on the board.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, please.
My name is Leah Greenbaum. I work for the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, so another state agency, and I was just wondering what your coordination has been like with the public sector so far, and what your sort of dream collaboration or partnership with the public sector might look like if you don't have that already.
Is that for me? I'll jump in. I guess, so far, I'm being a researcher, I'm always looking for data and where can I collect samples and get samples. And so, access to, maybe I should back up. So far, I haven't really worked with the kind of emergency response groups around Paradise, at least at the state level. There's been a couple of groups from the State Water Board and DWR, a few people that have kind of worked at the watershed level that I've had some contact with, but I think there would definitely be a lot more opportunity to get samples and get access to collecting samples so that we can get a better picture of kind of what's going on out in the field, I guess.
I think I'll also respond to that question. I work directly with the Sonoma County Water Agency, so they have a responsibility for supplying wholesale water to the city of Santa Rosa. And those research connections, me knowing them ahead of time was crucial to implementing our sampling program. As I mentioned, we mobilized within days. And so without that connection, we would never have been able to facilitate that type of work. And so Jackson mentioned Paradise. Well, we both have been interfacing with some folks out of Butte County and other folks out of DWR. So the challenge was, well, who do I reach out to ahead of time to be able to work with them and come up with a plan?
If I could just add to that a little bit too, even the folks that kind of responded immediately after the campfire, there wasn't a lot of it was a very hasty response, and like, what do we do? How do we get this done? What do we even need to look at here? And I think everybody was trying to kind of figure it out on the fly. There was no plan in place really to assess the effects on on the watershed, on the surface water. And so, some guidance, I think, from the agencies would have been helpful initially.
So I'll bring up another point that Jackson had mentioned, the guidance aspect, that there is no guidance on what a water agency or a county should do after a fire in terms of their water quality. And I'm currently working with some people out of the EPA to develop these type of guidelines. However, this is a long, it's in the future, so we don't have anything right now to be able to say, here, this is what we should do, and this is the plan.
That's Cal EPA.
The California EPA.
Other questions?
I have one. Michele, you mentioned earlier that we don't know a lot about the effects of groundwater, but with what data and models we do have, what are those effects with groundwater quality and also groundwater recharge rates and things like that?
Okay, so there's two things. So in terms of, I'll start with recharge for one. So after a fire, you can imagine that the most immediate effect would be a reduction in recharge within some of these burned areas of your watershed. And if you have an aquifer where you want recharge, it's inhibited because of the ash layer on the surface. And when rain falls, you get enhanced runoff. However, over time, your recharge rates return to normal after that ash layer is removed. However, some of the issues of the burned soil on the landscape, those still remain. So you would still have some potential longer term for contamination after a fire. And then related to what we do know about groundwater, so there is not a lot of data, but there are a lot of models. And our models can help us understand the movement of groundwater plumes, for example, benzene. We can use models to understand that. However, because it's so challenging being able to collect groundwater data, it's often hard to really bridge those two things together. So when I think about the groundwater models that I run, it's usually with a set of data, and then we do have a plan for installing more wells, for example, to be able to collect additional sampling points. And then the model really tells us, based on the geochemistry, based on the sediment heterogeneity, where a plume may potentially move. So did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, please.
I'm Christina Martinez with the Occupational Safety and Health Standards Board, and this question is for Mary. We're currently one of those agencies that is hastily trying to provide guidance. And so my question to you is, if you could make one recommendation that would provide the most bang for the buck to help workers who have to be outside in the aftermath of a wildfire, what would you recommend, given your research?
Well, we know that the N95 Mask do, filter the particles. The research is lacking on at what level do they need to put them on, and the long-term effects of wearing it versus not wearing it. But if they have to be out, that's the only option that they have, is to wear some type of filtration device. Does that?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please. That's you. Yeah.
I'm Naomi Andrasik with the Learning Policy Institute, and we think a lot about kids' issues, focus mainly on education, but there's a lot of intersectionality there with child health and rates of poverty and trauma that already existed in some of these communities before the fires ever came. So when we're thinking about long-term outcomes, we're thinking about things like traumatic experiences that kids have with wildfires, but also what's the quality of the supports they get in their educational systems afterwards. And we know with Paradise, right, they've already started resuming classes, but they're in warehouses, and a lot of these kids were already couch surfing before the fire burned down the homes that they were living in. So I guess my question is, we're thinking about long-term outcomes for children, what their lives are going to look like, what their opportunities are going to be. What are your thoughts about the intersectionality of these different things and how they come together?
Oh, that's a hard one. It's it's an extremely important topic. There was just an article that came out that showed that there's an association with air pollution and teen psychosis. So, that even heightens the concern for these children that were in the fires. I think that's a hard question to answer. I mean, when we can have more, concrete data and research on recommendations, I think that would help tremendously, but it is lacking. We can, as best possible, look at the populational health studies from air pollution and try to, apply those to the wildfire situation.
Thanks, Mary. Yes, please.
Dave Michele from the Energy Commission again. The state just has a new goal of 100% new on new homes that they are have PV or zero carbon. So, has anyone done an analysis on exactly? I think Jackson's point is if they are in a wildfire, what kind of contaminants would they add, not just to the water but to the air? And so that's a concern since we're trying to implement that policy.
Not that I'm aware of, but I think that's a great point.
And also, I mean, obviously we're building more fire resistance homes, so there's new materials going in some of these areas. And I think Sonoma's leading that effort on some of the rebuilding. So it'd be interesting to see if someone who does some kind of study on those new materials to make homes more fire resistant.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yes, please.
Yeah, this is for Mary again. Mary's Jeff Williams again from ERB. One of the questions that I'm getting asked a lot and running into and dealing with other public agencies is when there's a fire, there's a smoke event, at what point do we close our schools? Do we cancel our events?
Right.
I've heard the number of an AQI of 200. The AQI has its own issues, which you want to go into now, but do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what would be the bright line, or is there one?
That's a huge, I know Stanford is working with some of the other universities trying to come up with like a Bay Area-wide policy because it's such a difficult topic because the answer may be different for young, healthy, college-age students being out in that air versus an older faculty member with, some heart issues. So it's, I think as best possible, if the at the public school level and at the university level, if they can come together with some type of consensus, rather than having every school make that decision, it would be a better solution, and based on more on what evidence we do have right now.
Thank you.
Amber.
This is a follow-on to Jeff's question related to the schools. And how do you then distinguish, the kids who may not have a safer place to retreat to, and that the schools themselves might have better air quality inside them?
Right. And how do we know which schools have better air quality inside? That is true. There are. I have seen some readings where the air, and heard some stories where the air quality inside a building was actually worse than what it was outside, and they thought that they're actually being protected by being inside. I think some type of statewide guidance for all of the elementary lower level schools and then the university schools would be very helpful, because I know just from like my own children's school, it was just the principal making a call, and there's no way that all those principals can have the same access and understanding of the health implications of closing the school versus keeping the kids indoors during recess or whatever.
Yes, please.
So I we're talking about water quality, we're talking about building materials, infrastructure. There's a role for tech in all of this too. I think tech can be very helpful with, helping us with predictive models, with better control systems, all of that. But again, I get frustrated because we're not looking at all of this together. I actually have my daughter and son-in-law live in Sonoma County, done some work with the Water Authority. They moved in the day the fires hit. So there's a lot of work I know is being done up there. Can we find some of these hot points? Like you're in the middle of research, it would be great to, I do a matrix a lot with the governor's office where I show them here's everything happening in Crossways. If we can find touch points, crossovers there, so that we don't make mistakes in how we're doing the planning, so that we are putting more toxins in for when a fire happens, and we're doing less on the front end that's really being preventive. Because I think the worst outcome is when we have all these school closures and all this risk for folks, and all this stuff going into the watershed, whether it's building structures, which are probably worse, but finding those touch points and getting everybody working together on them.
So you bring up a very important point about researchers, county, city, all of these people working together to be able to either come up with solutions or even just understand what's happening within their system. And it's very frustrating from the researcher side as well that there is no integrative data management system for us to access, to be able to facilitate these type of interactions. And one thing I think Jackson and I, we've talked about, is having that sort of integrated data management framework where we have all of our data, historical data as well as current data, to be able to pull from. So we can say, well, in the past our mercury levels were here and now they're here, and this is how it's changed relative to our flows in the groundwater and surface water. So I think a data management framework is especially important when you have a scientific backing to be able to understand that. And you need that to be able to interface with all of these different groups.
Yes, please.
Just a comment on that. I mean, the current process is that actually through OES, there's the state hazard mitigation planning effort, and the local plans go through that kind of exercise with all hazards, including wildfires. So within that, it's supposed to tie back to the safety element of each general plan for local government. And that's the place where they can take that data and actually use it to help their specific vulnerabilities. So that, I think, there needs to be some awareness that really needs to kick in and start building strategic partners across all these elements you're speaking about. So I think that's not happening yet at the level from both the federal level, state level, and local level, and out to the researcher community to get that data started and then continually to be refined over and over and over.
If I could springboard on what you asked, and Leah, your point also, I think in addition to try to get all the active participants from different disciplines in a region thinking together about this problem holistically, as you're mentioning, I'd love somebody to comment on where are we in terms of groups across different regions sharing best practices. You're working in Paradise, you're working in Sonoma County, you're working in the San Joaquin, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, are you starting to see groups of researchers reaching out to their colleagues in the other areas to share what they're learning?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yes and no. There are certainly, I think at the ground level, people have, especially after Paradise, at the ground level, a lot of people reached out to Santa Rosa officials to say, "Hey, what did you do here? What happened here?" And some of that, some of that data was shared, that information was shared. That was really helpful for the folks in Paradise. But that really took some legwork and tracking down the right people to figure out, the answer to whatever question they were looking for. And so there's still a lack of ease of
just
transferring
connectivity
information.
not developed yet.
Right. Again, it was reactionary. Right. So we're still just reacting to wildfires and trying to come up with plans in a state of emergency, and that's not necessarily the best way to do this.
Mary, how about the health community?
Well, I would say at least at our center, especially since the campfire, there's a lot more communication across different schools within Stanford that before would not work together typically. So we're partnering with, for example, the Woods Institute to propose grants to look at some of these issues and include, the water component, the air component, and the health component, and try to draw people together. And it's, and realizing, we're now partnering with, fire consultants and these other groups that before we hadn't, to try to get a bigger picture. And our hope is that we can kind of take that model and use it in other places.
Very good, thank you. Oh, many questions. Yes, in the front here, you.
Okay, maybe I have a question. I'm Amalia Neikart, and I'm with Cal OSHA, kind of like what Christina said. We are tasked with looking to protecting outdoor workers. So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about, it piqued my interest when you said low socioeconomic status, because I'm thinking some of these workers have to be outside, and if they don't have maybe the same advantages as other areas, perhaps they cannot protect themselves when they're not working.
Right.
And then the other thing is, I wanted to ask you about the reference that you mentioned about the adults having strokes. And if I could.
Right. So there have been more and more studies showing that there are cardiovascular impacts from the wildfire smoke. And the Wetstein article, when they looked at all the California wildfires collectively across 2015, did see an increase in strokes, heart attacks within individuals age 65 and older. And it's kind of become kind of a boring topic, knowing that there's respiratory effects from the wildfire smoke, but the cardiovascular effects is now more of an interest in research, at least, to try to figure out what is the mechanism and how does the respiratory and the cardiovascular system interrelate. So that's become a more focused area of research. And then your comment about masks. So our lab has worked in the Fresno area for the past 10 years. This summer, a group of us went down there on a day when the particulate matter was pretty high, and we worked with a community group there, and their perception is that there are individuals who maybe know that the air quality is not good for them, but they have such other pressing needs, like, having a job and just providing for their families. And so there does not seem to be also an awareness that masks should be worn. So I think there's problems on many levels. And if you contrast that to, I know on campus at Stanford, there are requirements that the construction workers wear masks at certain times. And so I am not aware of that type of requirement, let's say, in the field workers down in the Fresno area. So I think there is, it's well known that air pollution disproportionately impacts the minority and low income. And wildfires are, I think, just another example of that.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So this is John Thompson from the Senate Office of Research. So with the campfire, we saw unhealthy air quality levels, in parts of the Central Valley throughout the Bay. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little to the challenges and strategies for assessing or predicting water or air quality impacts on a scale that's maybe like hundreds of miles from the vicinity of some of these catastrophic events.
Yeah, I know that they, use cloud plume data to try to, predict, and they follow the cloud plume data. We actually have there are no models that I'm aware of to try to predict when a wildfire is going to occur. and there's actually someone in our lab who's decided that that's their goal. He had done some previous work predicting when monsoons occurred, so this is what he's going to try to do. And then, of course, measuring the air quality and comparing it outdoors versus in someone's home, and it's a real challenge.
Yes, please.
Aside from increasing investments in forest management and fire prevention efforts that the state is doing right now, what are the policy solutions that you'd like to see to help mitigate some of the negative effects of wildfires? It's for all of you.
I guess I could speak one policy. We did a small study that showed that the use of prescribed burns has fewer health impacts than being exposed to a wildfire. So I know there's a lot of people interested in making it easier for the communities to do prescribed burning to try to mitigate some of the impacts of the forest fires. And then to just have more research to be able to make better recommendations, I think would be very helpful.
So I guess I'll comment. It's not so much a policy comment rather than what can we do after a fire. And the most immediate thing that I would mention is simply monitoring after fire the water. Counties are doing it on their own, and some counties can provide the funds and some counties cannot. So I think at a state level there can be a better investment in the simple act of monitoring after a fire, even before a fire, so we know what the pre-fire conditions are across our watersheds.
Yeah, I think that increasing our awareness of fire, right, as a society, and the fact that fire is becoming an increasing part of our life out here in the Western United States. So whether that's education and getting private land owners to take care of their land in a way that maybe helps their neighbors if there is a fire like this, or save their own property for that matter, and trying to bring this awareness to these communities so that there's more planning and preparation for fires at the front end of this than kind of this emergency response after the fire, right? And right now, everything that we're doing is addressing post-fire response, right? All of our efforts seem to go into fighting fire and then responding to the disaster right afterwards. And so trying to get more forward thinking and more awareness in our communities. And I don't know exactly what that policy is, but some kind of a public education campaign perhaps.
Great. Well, I think that's a nice question to end our panel. I'd like to very much thank the panelists. I'd like to thank everybody for attending and for the wonderful questions. Please let CCST know if you have any follow-up questions. We're collectively very, very happy to help you. Thank you.